The morning Ilara Thorn first encountered the dragon, she had been running from yet another beating. At 12 years old, her world consisted of narrow alleyways in the lower district of Kelthera, scraps of bread stolen from merchant stalls, and the constant ache of loneliness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Her parents had died in the plague 3 years prior, leaving her to navigate the harsh realities of orphan street life in a city that showed no mercy to the weak. The dragon fell from the sky like a broken star, crashing into the abandoned quarry outside the city walls where Ilara often went to escape the cruelties of civilization. The impact shook the earth beneath her bare feet, sending shockwaves through her thin frame. Most children would have run screaming back to the safety of the city, but Ilara had learned long ago that safety was a luxury she could not afford. Instead, curiosity drove her forward, toward the crater where smoke and steam rose in billowing clouds. What she found defied everything she thought she knew about the world. The creature was massive even in its wounded state, easily the length of 3 carriages, with scales that shimmered between deep emerald and midnight blue. Its great wings were torn and bleeding, one bent at an unnatural angle. Golden eyes, larger than dinner plates, gazed at her with an intelligence that made her breath catch in her throat. This was no mere beast, this was something ancient, something magnificent, and it was dying. The dragon's breath came in labored gasps, each exhalation creating small clouds of vapor in the cool morning air. Ilara could see the wounds that crisscrossed its hide, deep gashes that spoke of a violent battle, burns that suggested conflict with others of its kind, and, most troubling of all, the broken shaft of what appeared to be a massive spear protruding from beneath its left wing. Fear warred with compassion in Ilara's chest. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to return to the familiar dangers of the city streets. But, as she looked into those ancient golden eyes, she saw something that resonated with her own experience: pain, loneliness, and a desperate will to survive against impossible odds. In that moment, the wounded dragon ceased to be a monster from legends and became something she recognized, a fellow sufferer in a world that showed no mercy. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the dragon's labored breathing. The creature's great head turned toward her, and she felt the weight of its gaze like a physical presence. There was no aggression there, no threat, only exhaustion and what might have been surprise. Ilara had learned to read people's intentions in their eyes during her years on the streets. It was a skill that had kept her alive when larger, stronger children had tried to take what little she possessed. Now, looking into the dragon's eyes, she saw no malice, only a profound weariness that matched her own. The spear shaft moved with each of the dragon's breaths, and Ilara could see that the wound was becoming worse with each passing moment. She knew nothing about dragon anatomy, but she understood pain, and she understood that without help, this magnificent creature would die alone in this forgotten place. Her decision came not from courage but from a deep recognition of kinship. She had been abandoned by the world, left to survive on scraps and stubborn determination. Here was another being, far more powerful than she could ever hope to be, reduced to the same fundamental struggle for survival. The thought that such magnificence could simply fade away, unmourned and unremembered, seemed like the greatest tragedy she could imagine. "I'm going to help you," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "I don't know how, but I'm going to try." The dragon's response came not in words but in a sound that rumbled deep in its chest, not quite a purr, not quite a growl, but something that spoke of acknowledgement and, perhaps, incredibly, gratitude. Ilara's first challenge was the spear shaft. She could see that it was preventing the wound from clotting properly, but she also understood that removing it incorrectly could cause even more damage. She had witnessed enough violence in the lower district to understand the basics of treating wounds, though nothing had prepared her for working on a creature of this size. The shaft was thick as her arm and made of some dark what she didn't recognize. The spearhead was buried deep in the dragon's flesh, and she could see that simply pulling it out would likely cause fatal bleeding. Instead, she began to examine the angle of entry, the depth of penetration, and the surrounding tissue damage. The dragon remained perfectly still as she worked, though she could feel the tremor of pain that ran through its massive frame with each of her movements. Trust, she realized, was being extended to her, trust from a creature that had every reason to fear the touch of human hands. Working with nothing but her bare hands and a sharp stone she found near the crater's edge, Ilara began the delicate process of widening the wound around the spear shaft. It was gruesome work that left her covered in the dragon's dark blood, but she pressed on, driven by a determination that surprised even herself. Each time she wavered, unsure of her next move, she looked into those golden eyes and found the strength to continue. The removal process took hours. The sun climbed high overhead as Ilara worked, her small hands growing steady despite the magnitude of her task. She learned to read the dragon's breathing patterns, to distinguish between the sharp intake that meant she had caused pain and the slower exhalation that suggested she was on the right track. When the spear finally came free, the gush of blood nearly overwhelmed her. But she had anticipated this moment, gathering armfuls of moss and clean cloth scavenged from her own meager possessions. She pressed these materials against the wound with all her strength, her entire body weight thrown against the task of stemming the flow. The dragon's great head drooped with exhaustion, but its breathing began to steady. The immediate crisis had passed, but Ilara knew that infection was now the greatest threat. She had seen enough people die from infected wounds to understand the importance of keeping the injury clean. Over the next 3 days, Ilara made the quarry her home. She brought water from a nearby stream, carrying it in a cracked bowl she had found discarded near the city walls. She gathered herbs that she knew had healing properties: chamomile for inflammation, willow bark for pain, and honey stolen from abandoned hives to fight infection. Her knowledge was limited but practical, gained through necessity and observation. The dragon's recovery was slow but steady. On the second day, it managed to raise its head enough to drink from the bowl she offered. On the third day, it attempted to speak. The voice that emerged was like nothing Ilara had ever heard, deep as thunder but somehow gentle, with an accent that suggested vast age and distant origins. The words came in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow their meaning was clear in her mind. "Why?" the dragon asked, its golden eyes fixed on her small form. Ilara considered the question seriously. Why had she risked everything to help a creature that could have killed her with a single breath? Why had she spent her limited resources and precious time on something that could never repay her kindness? The answer, when it came, surprised her with its simplicity. "Because no one should die alone," she said. "Because everyone deserves a chance to live, even if the world has decided they don't matter." The dragon's great head tilted as it studied her response. When it spoke again, the words carried a weight that seemed to press against her soul. "You speak truth that many of my own kind have forgotten, little one. I am called Vetharion, last prince of the skyward realm. I will remember this kindness, Ilara Thorn." The fact that the dragon knew her name should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Of course this ancient creature could see into her heart, could understand who she was beyond the layers of grime and desperation that marked her daily existence. As Vetharion's strength returned, he began to share fragments of his story. He spoke of a realm among the clouds where dragons ruled with wisdom and grace, of a war that had torn his people apart, and of a betrayal that had sent him plummeting from the sky. His wounds had been inflicted by his own brother, jealous of Vetharion's position as heir to their father's throne. "Power corrupts even the noble," he told her as she changed the dressing on his wing. "My brother believed that strength alone should determine rulership, that compassion was weakness. Our father disagreed, and named me as his successor. The war that followed has consumed our realm for 3 centuries. Ilara listened to these tales with wonder and growing understanding. Here was a creature of immense power who had been cast down by those who should have protected him. Here was someone else who had learned that strength meant nothing without wisdom, that true power came not from the ability to destroy but from the choice to preserve. "Will you go back?" she asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Vetharion was quiet for a long moment, his great eyes reflecting the dying light. "Someday," he said finally. "When I am strong enough to make a difference. When I have learned what I need to learn to be worthy of leadership." "What do you need to learn?" Ilara asked, genuinely curious. "How to be strong without being cruel," he replied. "How to lead without forcing others to follow. How to find power in connection rather than domination." He turned his great head to look at her directly. "You have taught me more about these things in 3 days than I learned in 3 centuries of royal education." Ilara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment. "I don't know anything about leading," she protested. "I can barely take care of myself." "Can you not?" Vetharion's tone held gentle amusement. You saw a creature in pain and chose to help despite the danger to yourself. You committed your resources to healing when you had little to spare. You offered comfort to someone who was alone, even though you yourself know loneliness. These are not the actions of someone who cannot lead, little one. These are the actions of someone who understands that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than pushing them down. By the end of the week, the Therian was strong enough to fly, though his movements were still stiff and his endurance limited. Ilara knew that their time together was coming to an end, and the knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. She had grown accustomed to having a purpose beyond mere survival, to having someone who valued her thoughts and presence. I have to go, the Therian said on what they both knew would be their final evening together. But this is not goodbye forever, Ilara Thorn. I swear to you by the winds that carry my people, I will return when I am able to offer you something more than the friendship of a wounded exile. I don't need anything more, Ilara said quietly. Knowing you, helping you, that's been worth more than anything I could have imagined. The Therian lowered his great head until it was level with hers. Place your hand on my brow, he instructed. Ilara complied, feeling the warmth of the dragon's scales beneath her palm. Suddenly, her mind was filled with images and sensations that were not her own, the feeling of wind beneath wings, the view of the world from impossible heights, and, most importantly, a sense of connection that transcended physical distance. Now you will always be able to find me, and I you, the Therian explained. This bond is sacred among my people, reserved for those who have proven themselves worthy of absolute trust. You are the first human to ever receive this gift. When Vatharian took to the skies the next morning, Ilara watched until his form disappeared into the clouds. She felt hollow with loss but also filled with a purpose she had never known before. She was no longer just a street orphan fighting for survival, she was someone who had earned the respect and friendship of a dragon prince. That knowledge changed everything about how she saw herself and her place in the world. The weak, frightened child who had run from bullies just a week before was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others but from the courage to show compassion even when it came at personal cost. She had destroyed her weak self through an act of kindness, and, in doing so, had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Part 2, The Forging of Iron. 23 years had passed since Ilara's encounter with Vatharian, and the girl who had once lived on scraps and fear had transformed herself into something the world had never seen before. The process had been neither quick nor easy, it had required her to systematically dismantle every aspect of her former self that had been built on desperation and weakness, replacing those foundations with something infinitely more durable. The change had begun almost immediately after Vatharian's departure. Armed with the knowledge that she was capable of greatness, that a being of immense wisdom and power had seen worth in her, Ilara had set about the deliberate construction of a new identity. She no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but rather as someone who had simply not yet discovered her full potential. Her first target had been her education. The lower district offered few opportunities for formal learning, but Ilara had always been resourceful. She began by offering her services to scribes and scholars in the middle district, trading menial labor for lessons in reading and mathematics. Her natural intelligence, sharpened by years of survival, allowed her to absorb information with remarkable speed. The young woman who had once stolen bread from market stalls now found herself debating philosophy with retired professors and learning the intricacies of statecraft from minor nobles who needed secretarial assistance. She approached each new subject with the same methodical determination that had guided her treatment of Vatharian's wounds: careful observation, patient practice, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. By her 18th birthday, Ilara had become something of a legend in the intellectual circles of Kelthara. Here was a young woman from the poorest district of the city who could discuss military strategy with career officers, debate economic theory with merchants, and analyze legal precedent with trained lawyers. More importantly, she had developed a reputation for being someone who could find solutions where others saw only problems. It was this reputation that brought her to the attention of Lord Commander Aldred Blackwood, the military leader responsible for defending the northern provinces against the increasingly aggressive raids from the mountain clans. Blackwood was a practical man who cared more about results than social standing, and he had heard enough stories about the brilliant young woman from the lower district to overcome his prejudices about her background. "I have a problem that requires unconventional thinking," he had told her during their first meeting. The mountain clans have changed their tactics. They no longer attack in predictable patterns, and my traditional military responses have proven inadequate. I need someone who can see beyond conventional strategies. Ilara had studied the problem for 3 days, poring over maps and raid reports, interviewing survivors and analyzing the political dynamics of the mountain territories. Her solution, when she presented it, was so elegantly simple that Blackwood initially dismissed it as naive. "You're fighting the symptoms instead of the disease," she had explained. "The clans raid because they need resources, particularly during the harsh mountain winters. Instead of trying to stop the raids with force, offer them an alternative. Establish trade agreements. Give them reasons to work with you instead of against you. Trade with barbarians?" Blackwood had scoffed. "These people understand only strength." "Everyone understands their own best interests," Ilara had countered. "Right now, their best interests are served by raiding. Change that calculation, and you change their behavior." The implementation of Ilara's strategy had taken 2 years and required her to personally negotiate with clan leaders who had never dealt with anyone from the lowlands beyond the edge of a sword. She had learned their languages, studied their customs, and earned their respect through a combination of practical intelligence and absolute honesty about what she could and could not offer. The result had been the Treaty of the High Passes, an agreement that transformed a region of constant warfare into one of mutual prosperity. The mountain clans gained access to lowland goods and technologies, while the northern provinces gained valuable trading partners and a buffer against threats from even more distant territories. More importantly for Ilara's personal development, the negotiations had taught her that power came not from forcing others to submit to your will, but from understanding what they needed and finding ways to align their interests with your own. It was a lesson that would prove invaluable in the years to come. Lord Commander Blackwood, impressed by her success, had recommended Ilara to the royal court as a diplomatic advisor. This position brought her into contact with the complex political dynamics of the kingdom, where she quickly distinguished herself as someone who could navigate competing interests without losing sight of the greater good. The court of Kelthara was a place where weakness was exploited mercilessly and where even the slightest miscalculation could result in political destruction. Ilara had entered this environment as an outsider with no family connections or inherited wealth to protect her, which should have made her vulnerable to the machinations of established power brokers. Instead, she had thrived by refusing to play the game according to the traditional rules. While other courtiers focused on accumulating personal advantage, Ilara concentrated on solving problems that actually mattered. When noble families feuded over inheritance disputes, she found ways to resolve their conflicts that left everyone better off than they had been before. When trade negotiations stalled over seemingly irreconcilable differences, she identified underlying interests that all parties could embrace. Her approach was based on a simple principle that she had learned from her experience with Vetharion: true strength came from building others up rather than tearing them down. Every alliance she forged, every problem she solved, every crisis she diffused added to her reputation as someone who could be trusted to work for the common good rather than personal advancement. This reputation proved its worth when the kingdom faced its greatest crisis in living memory. The plague that had killed Ilara's parents 20 years earlier had returned with a vengeance, but this time it was spreading far beyond the lower district. The disease showed no respect for wealth or social position, cutting through the population like a scythe through grain. The Royal Council's initial response had been predictably inadequate: quarantine the affected areas and hope the disease burned itself out. Ilara had argued for a more comprehensive approach that would address both the immediate medical crisis and the underlying social conditions that allowed diseases to spread so rapidly. "We can't solve this by simply building walls around the problem," she had told the assembled nobles. "Disease thrives on desperation, overcrowding, and poor sanitation. We need to address those root causes or we'll face the same crisis again and again." Her proposal had been ambitious to the point of seeming impossible: a complete restructuring of the city's infrastructure to provide clean water and adequate housing for all residents, regardless of their social status. The cost would be enormous, requiring unprecedented cooperation between the government, merchant guilds, and religious organizations. What made the plan politically feasible was Ilara's ability to demonstrate that it was in everyone's self-interest to support it. Merchants who initially balked at the expense were shown how disease outbreaks disrupted trade and commerce. Nobles who resented spending money on the poor were reminded that plagues did not respect district boundaries. Religious leaders who worried about the theological implications of changing the social order were presented with arguments about the moral imperative to care for the suffering. The implementation of the Comprehensive Health Initiative, as it came to be known, took 5 years and required Ilara to essentially function as the coordinator for the entire kingdom's domestic policy. She had thrown herself into the work with characteristic determination, personally overseeing everything from the design of new sewage systems to the training of medical personnel. The results spoke for themselves. Not only was the immediate plague crisis resolved, but the kingdom's overall health and prosperity improved dramatically. Life expectancy increased, infant mortality declined, and productivity rose as people spent less time sick and more time contributing to society. More importantly, the success of the initiative established Ilara as an indispensable figure in the kingdom's governance. She was no longer just an advisor offering suggestions, she was the person that everyone, from the king down to the humblest citizen, looked to when they faced problems that seemed impossible to solve. This transformation had not been without personal cost. The relentless focus on improvement and achievement had left little time for the normal pleasures of life. Ilara had few close friendships and no romantic relationships. Her entire existence was organized around the pursuit of excellence and the systematic elimination of anything that could be construed as weakness or vulnerability. She had created a daily routine that would have exhausted most people half her age. Each morning began before dawn with physical training. She had learned swordplay, archery, and unarmed combat not because she expected to use these skills in battle, but because she refused to allow physical weakness to become a limitation. Her body was lean and strong, hardened by years of discipline and careful attention to nutrition and exercise. After physical training came intellectual exercise, reading, writing, and analysis designed to keep her mind sharp and her knowledge current. She maintained correspondence with scholars, merchants, and political figures across the known world, building a network of information sources that allowed her to anticipate trends and developments before they became common knowledge. The rest of her day was devoted to whatever crisis or challenge currently demanded her attention. She approached each problem with the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized her healing of Vatharian: careful observation, systematic analysis, and patient implementation of solutions. This process had required her to confront and overcome every aspect of her personality that could be seen as weak or limiting. The frightened child who had once hidden from bullies in the lower district no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who commanded respect through competence, who inspired loyalty through integrity, and who wielded power through service to others. The transformation was so complete that many people who met her found it difficult to believe that she had once been a street orphan. Her bearing was confident without being arrogant, her speech was precise without being condescending, and her manner was authoritative without being domineering. She had learned to present herself as someone who belonged in any setting, whether she was addressing the royal council or negotiating with foreign dignitaries. More fundamentally, she had learned to think of herself as someone whose opinions mattered, whose presence was valued, and whose contributions could change the course of events. The psychological shift from victim to agent had been the most important part of her transformation. Everything else had flowed from that fundamental change in self-perception. By her 35th birthday, Ilara had become something unprecedented in the history of the kingdom, a person of common birth who wielded influence equal to that of the highest nobles, not through inheritance or political maneuvering, but through sheer competence and moral authority. She was the person that kings consulted when they faced difficult decisions, that generals sought out when they needed strategic advice, and that ordinary citizens turned to when they felt their voices were not being heard. Yet despite all her achievements, Ilara was aware that she remained fundamentally alone. The bond she had shared with Vatharian during those 3 days in the quarry remained the closest connection she had ever experienced with another being. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she could still feel the echo of that mental link, a distant warmth that reminded her that somewhere among the clouds, her friend still remembered their time together. She often wondered what had become of him. Had he returned to his realm? Had he found a way to end the war that had cast him down? Was he still alive, or had the conflicts among his people finally claimed him? The not knowing was perhaps the only weakness she had been unable to eliminate from her life, the persistent hope that someday, somehow, she would see him again. What she could not have known was that Vatharion had never stopped watching her. Through their bond, he had witnessed her transformation from frightened child to confident leader. He had felt her struggles and celebrated her victories, even as he fought his own battles in the realm above the clouds. The war among the dragons had indeed ended, but not in the way anyone had expected. And, now, with news of developments in the human world that could change everything, it was time for him to honor the promise he had made 23 years before. The weak self that Ilara had systematically destroyed could never return because she had replaced it with something far more durable, a sense of purpose rooted in service to others and a confidence born from the knowledge that she had earned every bit of influence and respect she commanded. She had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength was not something you took from others, but something you built within yourself through the daily choice to be better than you were the day before. Part 3, The Return of the Sky Lord. The arrival of dragons over the capital of Kelthara was preceded by signs that only Ilara recognized for what they truly were. For 3 days, the wind had carried an odd resonance, a deep harmonic that seemed to vibrate in her bones. The clouds had taken on unusual formations, swirling in patterns that defied meteorological explanation. Most telling of all, the mental bond she had shared with Vatharion for over 2 decades had suddenly blazed to life with an intensity that made her catch her breath during a council meeting. He was coming. After 23 years of silence, her friend was returning, and he was not coming alone. Ilara excused herself from the royal court and climbed to the highest tower of the palace, a privilege granted to her by King Aldrich III in recognition of her years of service. From this vantage point, she could see the entire city spread below her and the horizon beyond the walls. As she watched, the sky began to change. They came from the north, a formation so vast it seemed to eclipse the sun itself. Dragons by the hundreds, their scales catching and reflecting the afternoon light in a display that turned the entire sky into a canvas of shifting colors. At their head flew a figure she would have recognized anywhere, Vatharion, no longer the wounded exile she had nursed to health, but something magnificent and terrible in his full power. He had grown larger in the intervening years, his wingspan now easily twice what it had been when she first met him. His scales had darkened to a deep blue-black shot through with veins of silver, and there was an aura of command about him that spoke of hard-won authority. This was no longer a prince in exile, this was a king who had claimed his throne through blood and wisdom. The sight should have been terrifying. Any rational person witnessing such a massive display of draconic power would have assumed it meant invasion, conquest, and destruction. But, as Ilara felt the familiar warmth of their mental connection strengthen, she understood that something far more extraordinary was about to unfold. The dragons arranged themselves in a perfect formation above the city, their movements coordinated with military precision. The citizens below had noticed them now, and panic was beginning to spread through the streets. Alarm bells rang from the watchtowers, and she could see soldiers rushing to their posts. Within minutes, the entire kingdom would be mobilized for war against an enemy they had no hope of defeating. Ilara did not hesitate. Using her authority as the king's chief advisor, she sent word to every guard post and military installation in the city: stand down, do not attack, and await further instructions. Her reputation was such that her orders were followed without question, even when they seemed to fly in the face of common sense. From the palace courtyard below, she could hear the sounds of confusion and mounting fear. But she also heard something else, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to speak directly into the minds of every person in the city. People of Kelthara, the voice said, and Ilara recognized it immediately as Vatharion's, though it now carried an authority that made her heart race. We come not as conquerors but as supplicants. We seek an audience with one who has shown us that wisdom and compassion are not weaknesses to be exploited, but strengths to be celebrated. The mental contact between them intensified suddenly, and Ilara found herself experiencing Vatharion's perspective as clearly as her own. Through his eyes, she could see the city spread below like a detailed map. Through his thoughts, she understood the magnitude of what was happening. The war among the dragons had indeed ended, but not through the victory of one faction over another. Instead, Vatharion had done something unprecedented in the history of his people. He had united the warring clans through the same principles Ilara had taught him during their brief time together. Rather than conquering his enemies, he had found ways to address their legitimate grievances. Rather than ruling through fear, he had built consensus around shared goals. The transformation had taken nearly 2 decades and had required him to fundamentally reimagine what it meant to be a dragon king. Traditional dragon leadership had been based on dominance hierarchies and territorial control. Betharian had created something new, a confederation based on mutual benefit and collective decision-making. But victory in the dragon realm had brought with it a new set of challenges. The unified dragon clans now possessed power on a scale that had never existed before. They could reshape continents, alter weather patterns, and command resources that dwarfed anything available to human civilizations. The question that faced them was simple but profound: what should they do with that power? Some dragons advocated for isolation, withdrawing from the world entirely and leaving other species to their own devices. Others pushed for domination, arguing that their superior capabilities gave them the right to rule over lesser beings. But Betharian had remembered a 12-year-old girl who had risked everything to heal a wounded stranger, and he had convinced his people to consider a third option: partnership. Ilara Thorn, Betharian's voice now spoke directly into her mind, private communication through their bond. Will you accept the honor we offer, not for your own sake, but for the sake of all who would benefit from your wisdom? Through their connection, she could see what he was proposing, and the scope of it made her dizzy. The dragons were offering to make her the symbolic ruler of a new kind of empire, not one built on conquest and subjugation, but one founded on cooperation and mutual advancement. She would be their bridge to the human world, their interpreter of mortal concerns, and their guide in learning how to use power responsibly. The title they offered was Empress, but it would be unlike any imperial position in history. Rather than ruling through force, she would lead through example. Rather than extracting tribute from subject peoples, she would work to elevate them. The dragon fleets would serve as guarantors of peace and protectors of the innocent, while she provided the moral framework that would guide their actions. It was an offer that should have been impossible to refuse, but Ilara found herself hesitating. Not from fear, she had long since conquered that weakness, but from a deep understanding of what acceptance would mean. This was not just a political appointment or a diplomatic position. This was a fundamental transformation of the world order, and she would be at its center. More personally, it would mean leaving behind the life she had built in Kelthara. The people she served, the problems she worked to solve, the relationships she had carefully cultivated, all of that would have to be reimagined in the context of responsibilities that span continents rather than kingdoms. But, as she considered the alternative, allowing the dragons to withdraw into isolation or, worse, to impose their will through force, the choice became clear. Someone needed to bridge the gap between human and dragon understanding, and she was uniquely positioned to serve that role. I accept, she said aloud, her words carrying across the mental link to Betharian and, through him, to the assembled dragons above. What happened next would be remembered for generations as the most spectacular ceremony in human history. Betharian descended from the formation above, landing in the great courtyard of the palace with a grace that belied his massive size. Around him, other dragons took positions throughout the city, not as occupying forces but as honor guards for a coronation unlike any other. The entire population of Kelthara had gathered to witness the event, drawn by a combination of curiosity, fear, and the kind of magnetic fascination that accompanies moments of historical significance. King Aldrich III himself appeared, flanked by his guards and advisors, to witness the elevation of his most trusted counselor to a position that technically outranked his own. Betharian spoke, his words carrying clearly across the assembled crowd through some draconic ability that Ilara had never fully understood. Behold Ilara Thorn, who showed mercy when she had every reason to show fear, who chose service when she could have chosen safety, who built strength through compassion rather than conquest. Let all who hear these words know that she speaks with our voice and acts with our authority. The formal investiture involved traditions that were older than human civilization, adapted for a ceremony that had never been performed before. Ilara found herself standing before the assembled might of the dragon clans, receiving oaths of fealty from beings who could have dominated the world through force but had chosen instead to seek guidance in the use of their power. The crown that was placed on her head was not made of gold or precious stones, but of crystallized dragonfire, a substance that existed nowhere else in the world and could only be created by the concentrated will of multiple ancient dragons working in harmony. It was simultaneously lighter than silk and stronger than steel, beautiful beyond description and imbued with properties that would allow her to communicate instantaneously with any dragon anywhere in the world. As the crown settled into place, Ilara felt the full weight of her new responsibilities settle upon her shoulders. Through her enhanced connection to the dragon network, she could suddenly perceive the scope of the realm she was being asked to govern. It stretched across continents and oceans, encompassing not just the dragon territories but any region where her new subjects chose to establish a presence. More than that, she could sense the expectations of thousands of dragons who were looking to her for guidance on how to interact with the broader world. These were beings of immense power and ancient wisdom, but they had lived in isolation for so long that they had lost touch with the concerns and needs of other species. They needed her to help them remember how to be part of something larger than themselves. The ceremony concluded with a demonstration that left no doubt about the reality of her new position. At the Therian signal, the dragons above began to move in perfect synchronization, creating patterns in the sky that spelled out her name and title in letters large enough to be seen from the ground. Then, as one, they roared their acceptance of her authority, a sound that shook the very foundations of the city and could be heard for leagues in every direction. But perhaps the most significant moment came after the formal ceremony had ended, when Betharian approached her privately as she stood in the palace garden, still overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Do you remember what I told you that last night in the quarry?" he asked, his great head lowered so they could speak eye to eye. "That I would return when I could offer you something more than the friendship of a wounded exile?" "I remember," Ilara replied, reaching out to touch the familiar warmth of his scales. "Though I never imagined it would be anything like this." "I have thought often about that time we shared," Betharian continued. "About the lessons you taught me without realizing you were teaching them. You showed me that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that ability. You demonstrated that the greatest victories are won not through conquest but through connection." He paused, his golden eyes reflecting the late afternoon sun. "The child who saved my life taught me everything I needed to know about leadership. The woman you have become embodies every principle I have tried to instill in my people. That is why this is not charity or sentiment, but recognition of what you have always been, a leader worthy of the greatest responsibilities." Ilara felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness but from a profound sense of completion. The frightened orphan who had stumbled upon a wounded dragon in an abandoned quarry had finally found the destiny that moment had set in motion. Every challenge she had faced, every weakness she had overcome, every skill she had developed had been preparation for this moment. "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," she said, quoting the ancient proverb that had become her personal philosophy. "But what I've learned is that destroying weakness is only the beginning. True strength comes from building something worthy to take its place." Betharian's rumbling chuckle was warm with affection and pride. "And what have you built, Empress Ilara?" She considered the question seriously, looking out over the city where she had spent most of her adult life, then beyond to the horizon where her new responsibilities waited. "Hope," she said finally. "I've built hope that power can be used wisely, that strength can be gentle, and that even the greatest enemies can become allies if you're willing to understand what they truly need." As the sun set over Kelthera, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the new Empress began the work that would define the rest of her life. Through her connection to the dragon network, she could sense conflicts and opportunities across the known world, regions where her intervention could prevent wars, territories where cooperation could bring prosperity, and peoples who needed protection from forces beyond their ability to resist. The weak self she had systematically destroyed over the course of decades was gone forever, replaced by someone strong enough to bear the weight of unprecedented responsibility. She had learned that true power was not something you took but something you earned, not something you wielded but something you served. And now, with the full might of the dragon clans behind her, she would have the opportunity to demonstrate those principles on a scale that could reshape the world. The girl who had saved a dragon had become an empress not through conquest or inheritance, but through the methodical cultivation of every virtue that mattered: wisdom, compassion, integrity, and the courage to use power in service of something greater than herself. It was a transformation that proved the truth of the ancient wisdom: those who destroy their weak selves through conscious effort and moral development can never be destroyed by others, for they have built their strength on foundations that no external force can shake. As night fell and the dragons took their positions as guardians of the new order, Ilara stood on her balcony and looked up at the stars. Somewhere among them lay the future she would help create, a future where power served wisdom, where strength protected the vulnerable, and where the choice to show mercy in a moment of crisis could ultimately change the destiny of worlds. The Dragon Empress had begun her reign, and the world would never be the same. End of document.